Hi, so in this review we will have a look at a game, the main theme of which would be material and why we have to take material if it's given, oftentimes. As Lasker has once said, the best way to refute a sacrifice is to accept it. And in this game, White declined on a sacrifice based on purely psychological reasons. Later we will see that White got in a lot of trouble and didn't really fight on as well as he could have. Let's have a look. So the game started as some Italian, I guess. Black is not really developing his pieces. White could already consider playing in the center, but bishop c4 is fine. d3. Again, d3 is a bit soft. Probably if black is playing so passively, we can play more actively. That's one of the rules in openings. If our opponent is playing passively, we can play actively to take up space. But okay, this is also fine. Now black developed his bishop to g4, which seems sensible enough, but this pin doesn't really do anything, especially if there's no knight c6 to d4 jump. And white can ask the bishop what he's doing. The bishop goes back. And now white played a pretty good move with g4, but he was really scared of the sacrifice, which happened in the game. We will talk about this in a bit. The sacrifice isn't supposed to work in general, especially if black is not developing his pieces and playing so passively, then his pieces will not be ready for such active play. The game should in general continue with bishop g4, bishop g6, and now white has a couple of plans. Usually it's connected to putting something on f5, maybe knight to h4, to go to f5. If black takes, we will take with the g pawn or even the e pawn, move the king, rook g1, and this is how white usually plays. This bishop is pretty bad on g6, it's hemmed in by all the white pawns, and such positions typically give white some advantage. This sacrifice is kind of thematic, but in general, if someone takes our g pawn when we're playing white, we cannot just say, oh no, and continue playing without the g pawn. This move knight g5 is basically an admission to resigning. It's as good as resigning the game. Since black is just a pawn up for nothing, he can even just go back, and he simply stole the pawn on g2. So this is basically lost for white. The computer says -3. We cannot play like this. So what was the problem? The player commented that his king will be weakened and black will have 2 pawns, and for this reason black is supposed to be better. But if we look at this position, well, what even is a weak king? Is it long-term weak or is it short-term weak? Here black has absolutely no pieces around the king. The usual procedure is to put the king on g2 to defend the knight. Next we can even play in the center. We can put a rook on h1, maybe even rook to g1, king to f1. Another maneuver is this, to put more pieces in defense, and there is absolutely no reason for black to even have enough compensation. 1 piece is more than 2 pawns, and apart from that, white's king is safe enough while black has no development. So it doesn't make sense not to take this piece. In general, we have to be kind of greedy in chess. A general good rule to follow is that we don't take material only if we see a concrete reason not to take it. Here, white didn't calculate any specific variation, he just decided that the king will be too weak. And this is not a good reason to give away the g4 pawn. So the game continued like this. So black is just a pawn up, a very big pawn up. So here, instead of having a weak king and a piece up, white just has a weak king and a pawn down. So there was no logic in not taking the piece. So the game continues. Black castles, which is probably not the most efficient way to play. He should use the nature of his advantage with h5. His advantage lies in the fact that white is a pawn down and also that his king is very weak. Here he can try to attack by taking on g4, opening the h file, putting the queen on h4, probably castling queenside eventually, and this just looks terrible. Instead, as we skip a few moves, the white king ran away. Again, white's problem here isn't exactly that he has a weak king, because again the pieces aren't that dangerous here. White needs to do something. He needs some counterplay. He is a pawn down after all, so statically he is not really getting anything here. Maybe he should exchange queens, and this should be a good thing in general. Maybe take up some space on the queen side to not allow b5. But white has to do something useful. Why the king would be useful on e2, it's not clear. White has lost 2 tempi. Black can use this to his advantage, take some space on the queen side as well. And now black is basically winning on both sides of the board. Next can come knight c5, maybe b4, a4. Eventually black can exchange the bishop, and white's play here is not clear. In a few moves white got to exchange the queens, and d5 was played. Here the player understood that d4 is coming to take up more space, and he decided to play rook a e1, which again doesn't really make sense if we see that d4 is coming. In general, white has to understand again his problems. Now the problems are not with the king. Without queens, his king is not in that much danger. Now he needs to get compensation for the pawn, because he is a pawn down. His compensation can be this bad bishop, but he has some nice centralized pieces, and he should do something with them. Maybe just take here. If black takes like this, we can exchange some more, and now this bishop is not as closed as in the game. Now it is at least attacking this pawn, and white can continue playing actively, maybe creating a weakness here. If it takes with the pawn, we can even take space here, threaten a5. For example, black has to play a5, we can play f4. And here, when black gets this isolated pawn on d5, after exchanging these two, the pawn advantage will not feel as bad for white, since the pieces are not great for black. Instead, the pieces were closed. White played knight a4, which in general doesn't really make sense to exchange knights when we are material down. The knight can go to f5 instead, or to f4 if black takes. So on e2 is quite nice, while this knight is not really doing anything, so there's no reason to exchange it. Furthermore, black has this very nice move of knight d7, which actually just wins the knight, because b5 is the next move, and the knight is completely stuck. And this is the problem with giving up space for nothing. But the knights were exchanged. White eventually played f4, which is nice. Some stuff got exchanged. And here it seems white has some compensation for his pawn, while this bishop is not great. Rook goes to d8. And this was white's major chance to do something active. Again, white has to understand that if he keeps up not creating real threats, he will lose in the long term, because he is a pawn down. White now had a pretty simple tactic with either g5 or e5. The point being, black cannot take either pawn because of bishop b3. For example, here the rook will drop and the game is over. So if black cannot take here, he will likely just lose the pawn. He can play, for example, king f7, and here he has lost the pawn but activated his king, and now white cannot really be worse here. We can exchange everything to a bishop endgame, and the king will go here. So g5 is a forcing move, which has to be thought about. The other forcing moves are like bishop b3, but white played c3, which doesn't really create any threat. There is no real reason to do this. Black took, which doesn't really make sense either, to give more center to white. Black should just improve his position, maybe play h6, or maybe bishop f7, and this tension doesn't really favor white. He doesn't really want to expose the d3 pawn. Instead, this happened. In a few moves we got a rook endgame, and here white has basically equalized, because his rooks are very active, and he also has a very active king, and black is the one that has to win somehow. Typically, it's good when we have a pawn down to trade into rook endgames, because they are notoriously known for drawing tendencies, because a lot of theoretical rook endgames when we are pawn down are pretty good. Well, by pretty good I mean drawn. for the defending side. So here we're kind of going towards that. White is improving his position, putting the king on d3. After g5, this move created a lot of new weaknesses, and now after something like rook f3, or in this for that matter as well, white shouldn't really be a lot worse. Though here, after rook f8, white is forced to play e5 and open the position not in his favor, which is why probably this was more accurate to go here. But black plays here, and again, it's not clear how black is supposed to win. One plan is to play h5, but that doesn't necessarily help black, and plus white can even stop it probably. For example, like this. If we go for example here, now h5 will not really do much because there is this pin, and white is terribly active. Black's pieces are completely tied to the f6 pawn, and black can basically never win here. His only plan would be to create a passed pawn here, but that's always under control. So instead white kind of wins the game for black by playing e5 and opening the position for no reason. And this is one interesting moment to think about. There is no reason to play e5. Again, black doesn't really have a plan. White can just put his rook on a2 to be flexible, maybe here, maybe push some pawns but not too many, maybe even play d5 in the center. Black's extra pawn is basically this pawn, so it doesn't really change much about the position. And again, about h5, we can even stop it. And it's unclear how black is supposed to make progress here. But after e5, some rooks get traded, and also white is kind of down another pawn here. Maybe he missed this check. But even if he takes here, after trading some rooks, for some reason black's rook just got active for free. So there was no reason to do this. Now white played this move rook e5, and he played it quite quickly with 11 minutes, but this move is completely losing, and it should be quite obvious that it's losing. At the moment black is up 2 pawns, so basically all pawn endgames will be winning for black. Of course here white is trying to win this pawn, and he will, but a pawn down in a pawn endgame is also usually losing. And specifically here we have to understand the structure. Black has the potential to create the outside passed pawn on the a file with b6, a5, b5, a4, or just a5, b5, a4. So this king will have to run away, and the whole center will collapse by this king. So this has to be quite well understood by white. The position itself is not that bad, because even though we are 2 pawns down, neither of these 2 pawns can really do anything. So white can try to activate his rook, maybe play c4, d5, try to get this pawn, and if he gets at least 1 pawn back, he will have very good chances to draw. But here black wins by simply trading to a pawn endgame, and b4 tries to stop a5, but after b6 the pawn will go to a5 anyway. The white king will be pulled to the queen side, and the game will be over in short order. So this happened, and the rest of the game is not very interesting. So there were a couple of things to look at here. Mainly it was about the opening, where white for some reason just didn't take the free piece and decided to instead play without his g-pawn, which is basically the same as resigning. We should at least gamble. If we don't understand if this is good or not, we should at least go for it, because here it should be quite obvious that the position is bad. So if there are 2 choices, we go for the unclear one instead of the clearly bad one, even though it might not be as comfortable. So yeah, so this was the main point of the game. White should really think about what happened here.